There is no such thing as Final Fantasy. Now, that's a bold claim given that there's 16 of them excluding any spin-offs. But hear me out. I often hear other fans of the game say that a Final Fantasy game feels like Final Fantasy. But what exactly does that mean? Does it matter if a game feels like Final Fantasy? And wouldn't it help Square Enix's brand identity if one of their main game series had an identity it could call its own? So I'm going to explore why more recent entries of Final Fantasy don't really feel like Final Fantasy games, what other games do differently, and ultimately what Square Enix should be doing to get back to that Final Fantasy feeling. I was introduced to Final Fantasy during the PSX generation, meaning that the first game I had played in the series was Final Fantasy VII. Like many people, this was my first encounter with the JRPG, having only really played platformers and point-and-click adventure games beforehand. When Final Fantasy VIII and IX came out later, they had their own unique stories and settings, but they somehow managed to feel like they belonged in the game series. They felt like Final Fantasy games. I can appreciate that that's my own experience, and that people got into the Final Fantasy games earlier or later on than I did, may feel like other games in the series feel more like Final Fantasy games to them. The point I'm trying to make here is that it can be pretty hard to determine what actually makes a Final Fantasy game. Surely it's more than just throwing in chocobos and moogles, right? As video games began to evolve with better hardware, debates broke out as to whether turn-based battles still had a place. I think that given the popularity of more action-oriented titles in the West, Square Enix wanted as broad an appeal as possible, and given that Final Fantasy is the biggest selling JRPG series aside from Pokemon, it's hard to argue against that. That said, since they dropped the turn-based battle system with Final Fantasy XII, it feels like Square Enix have been searching frantically for the perfect system to replace the turn-based one of old. The problem that I see with this approach is that aside from sequels and spin-offs, battle systems between mainline Final Fantasy games have been completely different each time. Given that the thing that we do the majority of the time in JRPGs is fighting battles, this means that the best part of each new Final Fantasy game feels completely different to us. Music also plays a large part in why newer Final Fantasy games feel alien to the rest of the series. There's no mistaking Nobuo Uematsu's incredible scores of the past, but what was it about his music that made them so good? A large part of what makes Final Fantasy music stay with fans is just how strong the melody is in many of the game's songs. Walking past someone in the street humming the tune from an older Final Fantasy game, you'd know exactly which Final Fantasy game the song came from. These days, Final Fantasy soundtracks are more orchestral, which certainly has its own merits, making the games feel more cinematic than ever before. The problem here is that they don't have a stronger melody that the older games had. There are exceptions to this, like the fantastic Valse di Fantastica, literally Fantastic Waltz. Songs with a strong melody like this are pretty rare in new Final Fantasy games though, which is a real shame. It is possible to have a strong melody and be cinematic though. Look at the Final Fantasy VII Remake soundtrack. It's full of music from the original games and given more of a orchestral modern twist, but the original strong melody is still there. There are also staples to the Final Fantasy series, such as Chocobos, Moogles, Cactuar, Marlborough, Tombury, and more. This might be a bit of a hot take, but in the last couple of mainline Final Fantasy games, I'd argue that if you took all of these staples out of the game, it wouldn't make much difference. To me, they feel that because the game has the Final Fantasy title, that they've just slapped these staples into the game, and the job's a good one. My point in all of this is ultimately that some of these mainline titles could have been a JRPG of any other name. It feels like Square Enix don't really know what Final Fantasy is anymore. One way to try to figure out how Final Fantasy games can feel more like they belong in the series is by looking at what other JRPG series do to have their own feel. There are quite a few examples out there, but let's take a look at Dragon Quest and Persona. Both of these game series are extremely distinctive, but what makes them that way? Dragon Quest is quite possibly the most identifiable game series I can think of. For years, the series has used the iconic style from Akira Toriyama's character design, so immediately when you see a Dragon Quest game, you know exactly what it is. Either that or Dragon Ball Z at least. The visuals and environments all use the same art style too, which has only gotten better over the years. The music is also iconic. As soon as the main menu appears in Dragon Quest games, you know exactly what you're playing. Just the art direction and music alone are enough to make a Dragon Quest game. They're just that strong. This is why I'd argue that even some Dragon Quest spin-off games feel more like Dragon Quest than some mainline Final Fantasy games feel like Final Fantasy. The battle system in Dragon Quest games has always been turn-based, and they've evolved it over the years to make it more interesting, from adding features like the ability to psych up, to being able to use captured monsters in your party. You know what you're getting with a Dragon Quest game. The Dragon Quest series also has its own staples. These come in many forms, from monsters like slimes, to in-game gameplay mechanics like casinos, monster arenas, and Puff Puff.
Voila! Le Puff Puff!
They've iterated on the formula for years now, but they've never changed a mainline game in such a fundamental way to make it feel drastically out of place in the series. Let's take a look at Persona next. While the series has evolved over the years, it's easy to spot a Persona game when you see one. Let's explore what makes a Persona game. I'll mostly be discussing Persona 3 to 5 here, but even Persona 1 and 2 share many of the traits that are still present in Persona games today. The art style of Persona has changed over the years, and unlike Dragon Quest, the style and character design has evolved. The first games had that distinctive Shin Megami Tensei look and feel, which was dark and depressing, utilising character design from Kazuma Kaneko, whose monster designs are still used in Persona games today. Since Persona 3, Shinigami Soejima has taken over as art director and character designer. Every game since has had a similar look and feel to it, the main difference being the change in technology between the PS2 games and Persona 5 on the PS4. Although the soundtrack changes a fair bit between the Persona games, there are still common elements such as the Velvet Room music. That said, despite soundtracks being mostly different, the music used in each game has a similar feel to it, one that makes it feel like Persona games. They're also super melodic and hummable. The Persona games also use a turn-based battle system, which has its own flavour. Each character has their own persona, and in the protagonist's case, they can capture enemies and summon them as personas to fight alongside them. Personas have their own attacks and abilities, and different personas can have different elements or different types of attacks. Where this is useful is where an enemy is weak to a type of attack. The system relies heavily on exploiting enemies' weaknesses, and if you're able to exploit each enemy's weakness in battle, you'll get an all-in opportunity attack, where each party member piles in to beat down on the enemies for extra damage. This makes the battle system engaging and quick for the most part. There's more to it, but the battle system in Persona 3, 4 and 5 are very similar, which is unique to Persona games. Aside from everything that I've already mentioned, Persona utilises staples such as familiar monster designs used throughout the Shin Megami Tensei games. They're also famous for their social link gameplay and building relationships, the school settings that they take place in, and the dungeons that most of the action takes place in. Without these things, they would fail to feel like Persona games, so they're never left out. For too long now, Square Enix have leaned too heavily on the staples of Final Fantasy like Chocobos and Moogles in order to justify putting the Final Fantasy name onto mainline games, but they're just not good enough on their own. Familiarity with a game series is a combination of a lot of things. It's the whole package. When core gameplay changes drastically between games, players can't help feeling that it might as well be a completely unrelated game. The experience is jarring for fans expecting certain things from the series, and the games ultimately feel disjointed from one another. As we've gone over, other game series have proven that consistency and incremental improvements on existing formulas can make game series really stand out and feel like their own thing. Games can still evolve and maintain their identity, like how Persona 1 and 2 feel similar, how Persona 3, 4 and 5 feel similar to each other. I think that Square can learn from this. They have the scope to reinvent the Final Fantasy series, but need to find some kind of consistency between them. Personally, I would love to see them take the Final Fantasy VII Remake battle system and tweak it slightly for the next few mainline numbered games in the series. It's proven popular in the remake and works really well for this modern era of JRPGs. I'd also love to hear stronger melodies in the soundtracks of the new Final Fantasy games. They can still be orchestral in nature to make the games seem cinematic, but I miss being able to hum my favourite Final Fantasy tracks, and I'd love to be able to do that again. Also, what happened to fun minigames in Final Fantasy games? The Triple Triad card game in Final Fantasy VIII is one of the most popular minigames in all of Final Fantasy, so why not bring that back? Just without too much randomness like they did in Final Fantasy IX's Tetramaster. Chocobo breeding and racing is another favourite of mine, and utilises one of the series' staples in a really fun way. I don't think every Final Fantasy needs a golden saucer, but one or two really compelling mini-games can make a big difference in making the games feel like Final Fantasy games again. Ultimately, this has been a huge rant about how I wish Final Fantasy games were more consistent. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people that disagree with what I've said. Different fans like different things about the games, so there's no way to appeal to everyone at once, and everyone has their thoughts about the direction that the series has taken, and the direction that it should take in the future. As I'm not a game developer, there may be reasons that they can't do things that I've talked about here, but I can only dream and needed to get the thoughts out of my head and into this ranty video. If you stuck around this long and want to see more content like this in the future, consider liking the video and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and in the meantime, take care, and I'll see you later.